I arrived in Grayson Hollow just as the sun began to sink behind the crooked tree line. The town wasn't marked on any of my modern maps, and even the dirt road leading here felt as if it had been forgotten by time. My car's tires crunched against the gravel as I drove past weather-worn houses with sagging roofs and boarded windows. The air was thick, not with fog, but with an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every step feel heavier. When I finally pulled into the heart of the town, I expected at least some signs of life: a store, a gas station, maybe even a few curious locals. But Grayson Hollow was different. The streets were empty, the shutters nailed tight, as if the buildings themselves were hiding from something. The only movement came from a torn, wind-beaten sign swinging from rusted chains. "Welcome to Grayson Hollow." The letters were so faded it looked like the town itself had tried to erase its own name. I parked near what looked like the only inn, a narrow building with peeling paint and windows so clouded it was impossible to see inside. As I stepped out of my car, the temperature dropped. It wasn't the kind of chill that comes from the weather. It was something else, something that seemed to seep up from the ground and coil around my spine. I turned, scanning the horizon, and that's when I saw it high on the hill beyond the town, shrouded in dying trees and creeping fog, stood the Grayson mansion. Even from a distance, it didn't look abandoned. The roof was jagged, the walls dark with rot, but there was something about the windows, black, hollow rectangles, that seemed to be watching me. A part of me wanted to leave, right then, to turn the car around and vanish back into the safety of the world I knew. But another part of me, the part that had dragged me here in the first place, couldn't look away. I stepped inside the inn, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and was greeted by the faint smell of mildew and old wood. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his skin pale and thin like paper stretched too tight, his eyes sharp enough to cut through shadow. He didn't speak at first, he only stared at me, and then in a voice as dry as dust, he muttered, "You're here for the Grayson house, aren't you?" I hesitated, then nodded, his lips curled downward. "Foolish," he whispered, almost to himself. "Some places don't want to be found. That hill has taken more than it's ever given back." Before I could ask what he meant, he slid a tarnished key across the counter. "Room 3, he said, his voice trembling. "But if you hear anything in the night, don't open your door." I didn't reply. My hand closed around the key, cold and heavy like it had been buried for decades. As I climbed the narrow staircase, I felt it, that same suffocating stillness, thicker now, as if the entire building was holding its breath. And outside, through a dusty window at the end of the hall, I saw the mansion again. Only this time, I could swear I saw a light flicker in one of its upper windows. The next morning, I stood at the edge of the town's main road, staring at the narrow path that wound its way up toward the Grayson mansion. The air was colder up here, unnaturally still, as if the hill itself had been abandoned by the wind. My boots sank into the damp earth with every step, and though the sun was high, the trees that bordered the trail seemed to swallow the light whole. As I climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was heavier, like a weight pressing against my chest. I stopped once, glancing back toward the town below. From this height, it looked even smaller, almost fragile. No one was outside. No one was watching me. And yet, I felt eyes. When I reached the crest of the hill, the mansion loomed before me in its full rotting glory. Up close, it was worse than I'd imagined. Its walls, once white, were now stained a deep, sickly gray, and ivy clung to its sides like veins running through dead flesh. The iron gates were twisted and rusted, but they stood open as though inviting me in. I stepped through them, and the sound of my boots on gravel was swallowed by silence. No birds, no wind, just the mansion. Its windows stared down at me like hollow sockets in a skull. I walked across the overgrown courtyard, weeds curling up from cracked stone. until I stood at the front doors. They were massive, made of blackened wood, their surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize, sharp, angular shapes that seemed to writhe if I stared too long. My hand hovered over the brass handle, cold, colder than it should have been in the daylight. I pushed. The door gave way with a low moaning creak, the sound echoing through the cavernous dark beyond. Inside, the air was different, damp, heavy, and tinged with the faint scent of decay. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts of light that cut through the cracks in the boarded windows. The grand foyer stretched before me, a sweeping staircase split in two at the landing, its banisters draped with cobwebs. Portraits lined the walls, their frames gilded and rotting. Every face in those paintings belonged to a Grayson, and every set of painted eyes seemed to follow me. I stepped closer to one portrait, Elias Grayson, the patriarch. His face was stern, his eyes a deep, unyielding black, painted so vividly they seemed almost real. I didn't notice it at first, but then I realized something impossible. His lips were curled, not in a smile, not quite. It was expectation. The floor groaned beneath my feet, a low sound that vibrated through the walls. I froze. Somewhere above me, something moved. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another, dragging across the floorboards overhead. I swallowed hard and looked back toward the door. It was still open. I could leave. I could pretend none of this existed, but then I saw it, at the top of the stairs, just for a heartbeat, a shadow, tall, impossibly thin, and gone before I could blink. I wasn't alone in the Grayson mansion. I returned to the inn just before sunset, my boots heavy with dirt from the mansion's hill. I couldn't shake what I'd seen, the shadow at the top of the stairs, gone in an instant but lingering in my mind like a stain. The old inn was quiet when I entered, too quiet. The innkeeper sat behind the counter, hunched forward like he'd been carved from the same old wood as the building. His milky eyes flicked toward me the moment I stepped inside. "You went up there," he rasped, his voice like paper scraping against stone. "Didn't you?" I didn't answer right away, but I must have looked guilty enough, because he didn't need me to. He sighed, slow and heavy, like a man carrying decades of secrets. He motioned for me to follow him. We went into the back room, a small space lit only by a single oil lamp. Its light was dim and weak, but it was enough to reveal the walls. They were covered in yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs, all pinned haphazardly, as if he'd been piecing together a puzzle for years. "Look," he said, pointing to a photograph of the mansion. It was old, maybe from the 1800s, but the house looked almost the same as it did now. "That place is a grave," he whispered. "The Graysons built it, lived in it, and died in it. Every last one." I stepped closer, scanning the clippings. Headlines jumped out at me. "Local family mysteriously vanishes. No bodies found. Servants missing after storm. Mansion sealed by order of town. Grayson heir found dead in locked room." He reached for another piece of paper, an old handwritten letter. The ink had bled over time, but the words were still visible. "The curse is bound to the bloodline. None escape." I looked up at him. "Curse." His jaw clenched. "Elias Grayson," he said, almost spitting the name. "The patriarch. They say he made a deal with something. No one knows what. After that, people started dying. Servants vanished. His children." He trailed off, his throat working as if the words were hard to swallow. "Every generation, the same pattern. Death, disappearance, madness." The innkeeper's gaze darkened, and he leaned in closer. "And when the last heir vanished, the mansion didn't die with them. People still hear things up there, see lights in the windows. Some say it's the family. Others," his voice lowered to a trembling whisper, "others say it's what Elias brought back." I felt my stomach twist. My mind fought against his words, but something about them clung to me. They fit too well with what I'd seen. The old man suddenly gripped my wrist, his bony fingers like iron. If you're smart, you'll leave before nightfall. That house, it remembers those who enter, and it doesn't let go easily. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. His grip loosened, and he looked at me with a kind of pity I didn't understand. I backed out of the room, but just before I closed the door behind me, he called out, "If you hear the walls breathing, it's already too late." I returned to the mansion the following evening, despite the innkeeper's warning echoing in my head. The hill was wrapped in fog, and the skeletal branches of the trees clawed at the sky, as if trying to keep me from reaching the top. But I couldn't stop. Some part of me, reckless or cursed, needed answers. The front doors moaned as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was colder than before, stale and heavy, like the mansion itself had been holding its breath. Dust shifted in the dim light, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the same crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, the one I'd felt yesterday. I moved through the grand foyer, my boots creaking against the warped floorboards, and that's when I saw it. On the far wall, half hidden behind cobwebs and a thick layer of dust, hung a massive painting, a family portrait, the Graysons. I stepped closer, each movement slow, reluctant. There were 7 of them in the painting. Elias Grayson, tall and severe, his wife pale and rigid, and 5 children, their faces frozen in perfect lifeless stillness. But their eyes were wrong. They were too sharp, too real. I reached out and wiped away a layer of grime from the frame, and for the briefest moment, I could have sworn one of the children's eyes flickered, not moved, flickered, like candlelight trapped behind glass. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but the faces didn't change. They only stared. I told myself it was the lighting, the dust, my tired mind. But then I saw it at the bottom corner of the painting, faint but unmistakable, was a set of scratches, letters carved into the frame by hand. I crouched down and brushed the dirt away, revealing the words, "Don't look too long." A sharp sound cracked through the air. I froze. It came from behind me, a single deliberate footstep on the stairs above. I turned, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Just the staircase, vanishing into darkness. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something in the painting shift. Elias Grayson's mouth. It wasn't open wide, just the faintest curl at the corner of his lips, a smirk. I stumbled backward, my boots striking the floor with a deafening thud in the silence. Then I ran, out of the foyer, past the cold walls and their unseen whispers, until I reached the mansion's front doors. But when I pulled them open, I swore I heard it. Laughter, low, deep, and distant. I turned back one last time. The painting was still there, the family still staring, but now, every single one of their mouths had curved into the same faint knowing smile. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the Grayson family's painted smiles burned in my mind, their frozen faces twisting into something that felt alive. By morning, my hands were still trembling. I needed answers, answers that the innkeeper clearly wouldn't give me. So I went to the only place in town where I thought I might find them, the old general store. The bell above the door gave a hollow chime as I stepped inside. The store smelled of dust and old wood, and the shelves were stocked with little more than canned goods and faded newspapers. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with sunken eyes, her hands stiff as she wrapped a package in brown paper. When she saw me, she froze. "You're the outsider," she said, not a question but a grim statement. "You went up the hill." I didn't deny it. "I just want to understand," I told her. "What happened to the Graysons?" Her expression tightened, and she glanced around the shop, as though making sure no one else was listening. Slowly she leaned forward. "You shouldn't speak their name out loud," she whispered. "Not here." "Why not?" I pressed. She hesitated. "Because they hear it. Up there in that house, Every time someone says their name, the walls they wake up. A chill rolled down my spine. I almost laughed, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was no humor there, only fear. She slid a folded newspaper across the counter toward me. Its headline was from nearly a century ago: Grayson family vanishes, no trace found. They didn't vanish, she muttered. They were taken, one by one. And when the last heir disappeared, the house changed. I unfolded the paper and scanned the story. It spoke of servants who screamed in the night, of neighbors who heard chanting from the mansion's upper floors, and of doors that locked themselves from the inside. At the bottom of the article was a quote from an unnamed townsman. The Graysons made a bargain, and now the hill belongs to them. I looked back at her. A bargain with who? Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter. Not who, she said, voice barely audible. What? Before I could press her further, a loud thud came from the back of the store. Both of us froze. The sound came again, heavier this time, like footsteps. The woman's face drained of color. You need to leave, she hissed, shoving the newspaper back toward me. Go back to your inn. Don't look back. Don't stay out after dark. I backed toward the door, her warning ringing in my ears. But just as I stepped outside, she called out one last thing. If you keep going up that hill, you won't come back the same. The wind howled as I left the store, carrying her words with me like a curse of their own. And in the distance, far above the fog-draped trees, the mansion stood waiting, its black windows staring down like watchful eyes. The mansion felt different that night, colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, as if the air itself had been drained of life. My flashlight beam trembled against the walls as I explored deeper, each step heavier than the last. The floors groaned under my weight, and from somewhere in the distance, I swore I heard a faint scratching, like fingernails against wood. That's when I saw it. At the end of the eastern hallway, past rows of rotting doors and broken picture frames, there was one door unlike the others. It wasn't warped or splintered, like the rest. No, this one was different, sealed shut with iron bolts and wooden planks nailed across it, as if someone wanted to make sure it never opened again. I knelt down, running my fingers across the planks. Deep grooves scarred the wood, scratch marks, long frantic lines carved into the surface from the inside. Whatever had been in there had wanted out. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave it alone, but my hands moved anyway. It took me nearly an hour to pry the boards loose. The sound of each nail pulling free echoed like a gunshot through the silent halls. When the last plank fell to the ground, the door shuddered slightly, as if it were breathing. My hand hovered over the knob. It was ice cold. I turned it. The door creaked open, releasing a gust of air, so stale it burned my throat. My flashlight swept across the room and froze. Inside was a small chamber, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper the color of dried blood. Furniture lay in pieces, overturned and broken, as if there had been a struggle. In the far corner, a child's wooden toy horse lay on its side, one eye missing. And then I saw them. On the wall opposite me were words, dozens of them, scratched into the plaster, overlapping each other in a frenzy of desperation. Most were illegible, but one phrase stood out, carved deeper than the rest. He watches from the walls. My breath caught. I backed up a step, the floorboards groaning beneath me. That's when I heard it. A faint exhale. I spun, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the room was empty. Still, I felt it, the presence, heavy and cold, pressing against the back of my neck. And then, something moved. The wallpaper near the far corner bulged, just slightly, as though the wall itself was breathing. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw the faint impression of fingers pressing outward from the inside. I stumbled back and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding so violently I thought it would break my ribs. I didn't even bother reboarding it. I just ran. When I finally burst out into the main hall, gasping for air, the mansion felt alive again, groaning and shifting as if it had been waiting for me to find that room. And for the first time, I realized this house wasn't haunted, it was hunting. I didn't sleep after finding the locked room. Every sound in the inn, the groaning wood, the whistling wind, felt like an echo of the mansion breathing. But by morning, something stronger than fear pushed me back up the hill. I needed to know what I had stumbled into. The mansion was silent when I entered, but it no longer felt empty. My footsteps seemed to disturb something unseen, something listening. I didn't speak. I didn't dare. I moved through the halls, past the family portraits with their black, watchful eyes, and up the grand staircase until I reached the study. The door was half open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, as if the room hadn't been touched in centuries. A massive desk stood near the window, its surface littered with yellowed papers. But what caught my attention was the leather-bound book resting in the center, untouched by time. The name embossed on the cover made my stomach tighten. Elias Grayson. I opened it. The first few pages were mundane, business records, notes about land ownership, but as I turned the pages, the handwriting grew frantic, uneven, almost desperate. The words were no longer about business. They were about rituals. Blood binds the house. Blood opens the door. The offering must be taken willingly, or the walls will hunger. I read on, each entry worse than the last. Elias spoke of voices in the walls, whispering promises of wealth and power. He wrote about a ritual performed in the mansion's cellar, a pact sealed in blood, not just his but his entire family's. They will not die, one entry read. They will serve. They will remain in the house until it is fed. My hands trembled as I turned another page. This one was different. The ink was smeared, the handwriting jagged, but the words were clear enough. If the bloodline ends, the house will open its mouth. It will feed on the town instead. I slammed the book shut, my breath sharp in my chest. Suddenly, I understood the fear in the townspeople's eyes. They weren't just scared of the mansion. They were trapped by it. A soft creak broke the silence. I froze, staring at the door. Slowly, it swung inward. Though no one stood there, my flashlight beam trembled against the walls. For a brief second, I saw it, just beyond the doorframe. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, watching me from the dark. When I blinked, it was gone, but the journal in my hands felt heavier, almost as if the mansion itself didn't want me to leave with it. I shoved it under my coat and ran. The walls groaned, and the sound followed me down the stairs, like a low rumbling breath. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping in the cold air, staring back at that cursed house. The journal was real. The curse was real, and I had just stolen the one thing the mansion might kill to keep. That night, I couldn't shake the sound, even from my room at the inn. Far from the mansion, I swore I heard it. A deep, slow exhale, like an enormous lung, hidden beneath the earth, breathing in the dark. The journal of Elias Grayson lay on the table beside me, its leather cover cold as stone, and every time I glanced at it, I felt like it was staring back at me. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I had to go back. The climb up the hill was worse this time. The fog clung to my skin, heavy and wet, and every tree I passed seemed to bend slightly toward me, their branches knotted, like skeletal hands. When I reached the gates, they were already open, as though the house had been expecting me. Inside, the air was colder than it had any right to be. I stepped into the foyer, the floor groaning, like a living thing beneath my boots. Dust swirled lazily in the beam of my flashlight, but there was something wrong about it, something rhythmic. It moved, in time with the sound of breathing. I followed it through the main hall, every creak of the floor sounding like a muffled heartbeat. The portraits lining the walls seemed closer than before, their eyes following me not with stillness, but with awareness. I reached out and touched one frame. The glass was warm. Then I heard it. An inhale. Long, slow, deep. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The walls around me flexed ever so slightly, as though the house itself had drawn in air. I took one step back. The exhale came next, rushing through the hall in a low guttural sound that made the chandeliers above tremble. The floor shifted beneath my feet, subtle but undeniable. No, I whispered. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from upstairs, a door slamming shut, hard enough to shake the walls. I whipped my flashlight toward the staircase. For a split second, I saw movement, a shadow darting across the landing. My heart pounded. I should have left, but I couldn't. Something pulled me forward, a sick curiosity that overpowered every instinct to run. Climbed the stairs, the wood bending like muscle under my boots, until I reached the second-floor hallway. That's when I saw it. The wallpaper ahead of me bulged outward, like something was pressing against it from inside the wall. Fingers, long, skeletal, pushed against the fabric before sliding back out of sight. I stumbled back, hitting the opposite wall. The journal slipped from my coat, falling open on the floor. Its pages flipped wildly, until it landed on a single line, written in jagged ink. The house will breathe when it hungers. And then I heard it again, closer this time, louder. The walls inhaled, a deep and hungry sound, and every candle in the hallway flickered to life all at once, burning with a sickly green flame. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed the journal and ran, but even as I reached the front doors, I knew the truth. The house had woken up, and it was starving. The next morning, I returned to the mansion, with Elias Grayson's journal tucked under my arm. The sun barely pierced the heavy fog that clung to the hill, but I no longer expected daylight to offer any comfort. Inside, the mansion was unnervingly silent. No wind, no settling wood, only the heavy sound of my own footsteps as I pushed deeper into its decaying corridors. I wasn't here for the portraits, or the strange breathing walls this time. I was searching for something else. Proof. I found it in a locked door on the first floor, hidden behind a rotting tapestry. The journal had mentioned it. The ledger room. Keep it sealed. The house remembers. The door was stiff, the lock rusted, but after several minutes of forcing it open, it finally gave way. The room inside was narrow and lined with shelves sagging under the weight of old books and ledgers. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the smell of old paper and mildew was overwhelming. I opened the first ledger. It was a record of the Grayson servants' names, wages, and dates of employment. But the further I flipped through the pages, the stranger it became. The names didn't stop. Servants came and went, until they didn't leave. Page after page ended the same way. Disappeared. Gone without notice. No record of departure. I turned to the next book. More names. Dozens, then hundreds. Not just servants, neighbors, travelers, anyone who had ever stayed too long near the mansion. And then I saw the last page. Scrawled in frantic handwriting was a single chilling line. The house keeps what it is fed. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. That's when I felt it. A shift in the room's air, the pressure changing like a held breath. I turned, and that's when I saw them. Figures, faint and ghostly, standing in the corners of the room. Men and women in tattered clothing, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, mouths slightly open, as if mid-scream, but unable to make a sound. Their heads tilted in unnatural unison, watching me. One stepped forward. Its face was twisted, stretched thin like parchment, and its eyes were empty sockets. Its hand lifted, bony fingers pointing to the shelves of names, as if to say, "We are still here." My flashlight sputtered, and in that brief flicker of darkness, the room filled with whispers, countless voices, overlapping, desperate. "Don't let it take you. He's still here. The walls are hungry. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut with trembling hands. The whispers stopped instantly. Only silence remained. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I felt it again, that deep low exhale from the walls, almost satisfied. The mansion didn't just remember its victims, it kept them. I didn't want to come back, but the journal wouldn't let me go. That night I sat at the inn, with Elias Grayson's words etched into my mind. The house keeps what it is fed. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the missing servants, the ghostly figures, and the endless names in those ledgers. By dawn, I was back at the mansion. The front doors groaned like a living thing. As I pushed them open, I walked the familiar halls, my flashlight trembling in my hand, until I reached a section of the house I hadn't explored. A narrow hallway, half hidden behind a warped wooden panel, led me to a small door at the very end. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. Rot. The air was thick, sour, and wrong, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I stepped inside, my boots scraping against something sticky. I aimed my flashlight downward. Blood, dark, dried, and splattered across the floorboards in thick, ugly streaks. Some stains were old and blackened, but others looked fresher. My throat tightened. I wanted to run, but something in the corner of the room caught my eye. A trapdoor. I knelt down and pried it open. Rusted hinges shrieked as it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The smell grew stronger, metallic and suffocating. I gripped my flashlight and stepped down. At the bottom was a low-ceiling chamber. Chains hung from the walls, their iron links corroded and stained. Wooden crates were stacked against one side, and when I opened one, I staggered back in horror. Inside were bones, dozens of them, some small enough to belong to children, and then I saw the marks, scratches gouged into the stone walls. Words, not carved with tools, but clawed out by hand. Let us out. It's inside the walls. Feed it and live. I stumbled back, my light shaking uncontrollably. That's when I noticed something else. The floor beneath me wasn't flat. It was warped, bulging slightly upward, as though something beneath it was pushing to get out. A sound rose from the ground. A low, wet sound like flesh dragging against wood. I bolted. I didn't care about the noise. Didn't care if the entire house heard me. I ran up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. But even as I fled the room, I could still hear it. The faint sound of breathing. Not from the walls this time, from the floor. Back at the inn, I locked the door and spread Elias Grayson's journal across the bed. My hands were still shaking from the blood-stained room, but I needed answers. I had seen enough to know the mansion was more than haunted. This was something worse, something alive. I flipped through the journal until I found a section marked with a torn scrap of red cloth, its edges stiff with old blood. These pages were different, rushed, frenzied, the handwriting broken and uneven. The house is bound to us. Flesh for brick, blood for mortar, takes what we give, and in return, it keeps us. I stared at the words, flesh for brick, blood for mortar. The images from the blood-stained room flashed in my mind, the chains, the bones, the claw marks. Elias hadn't built a home. He had built a prison. Another entry written later was worse. The walls will hunger when the bloodline thins. I hear them at night. The voices, my children do not sleep. They walk the halls even when their bodies lie still. The pact will not break. We are the house now. I felt my stomach turn. The mansion didn't just hold the Grayson family. It was the Grayson family. Their flesh, their blood, their souls all fused into the very foundation of the place. That's why the walls breathed. That's why the floors pulsed beneath my feet. And the last entry chilled me most of all. If the bloodline ends, the hunger will spread. The town will feed it, one by one, until nothing remains but the house. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. The innkeeper's warnings, the terrified townsfolk, They weren't superstition, they were survivors, living in the shadow of something that had been feeding for generations. A sound drew me to the window. The mansion loomed on the hill, its black windows glowing faintly with a sickly green light, and for the first time I realized it wasn't the reflection of the moon or tricks of my imagination. They were eyes, watching, waiting. Then from the corner of the room, I heard it again, that deep, low exhale, not from the mansion this time, from the journal. I staggered back as the cover shifted ever so slightly, as though the book itself had taken a breath. The Graysons weren't just bound to the house, they were everywhere. I should have left. After what I'd read in Elias Grayson's journal, after the blood-stained floor and the faces in the walls, every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't, because one line from the journal wouldn't stop echoing in my head. The heart of the house beats below. Third night, I climbed the hill one more time. The mansion loomed against the sky like a wound carved into the earth. Its doors opened easier now, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the silence was heavier than ever. I followed the sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic pulse, deep and slow, vibrating through the floorboards. I walked past the grand staircase, and down a narrow hallway, until I found a door half hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf. It was small, wooden, and marked with the same symbols I'd seen carved into the mansion's entrance. The key I found in the journal fit perfectly. The door opened with a groan, revealing a steep stone staircase spiraling downward. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up to meet me, thick with the smell of mold and iron. No, not iron. Blood. I descended. The deeper I went, the louder the pulse became, until it felt like the stairs themselves were throbbing. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating walls lined with strange markings, and in some places, long streaks of dried crimson. At the bottom, I found it a cellar, vast and cavernous, its walls glistening, as if alive. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying gently even though there was no wind. In the center of the room stood an altar. It was made of black stone, its surface slick with something that wasn't dust. And above it, carved into the wall, were hundreds of handprints, some small, some impossibly large, all pressed so deep into the stone, they looked burned there. The journal's words came back to me, flesh for brick, blood for mortar. This was where it happened. I approached the altar, and as I did, the walls shifted, just slightly. I could hear it now, not just the breathing, but whispers, low, overlapping voices. Feed us, stay with us, join us. The air grew heavy, my flashlight flickered, and then from the corner of the cellar, the wall itself moved. A face, not carved, not painted, pressed out of the stone, its mouth opening in a silent scream, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Another face formed beside it, then another, until the walls were crawling with them, hundreds of trapped souls, their features twisted in eternal agony. The ground shifted beneath my feet, and I realized the pulsing wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from below. The heart of the house was alive, and it was waiting for me. I bolted up the stairs, my flashlight swinging wildly, but the voices followed, not loud, not shouting, just laughing. By the time I slammed the door shut behind me, I knew the truth. The cellar wasn't just the heart of the mansion, it was a mouth, and it was hungry. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cellar, the altar, the faces pressed into the stone, and the way the walls had moved. By morning, my hands still shook, but against every shred of reason, I climbed the hill again. The mansion felt different now. It wasn't silent, it was watching. The moment I stepped through its doors, I felt it, that weight, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the back of my skull. The portraits lining the foyer didn't just seem to stare at me anymore, they were staring. I could feel their eyes burning into me as I passed. I told myself, it was my imagination, that I'd been in this cursed place too long. But then I reached the eastern corridor. The wallpaper there had always been torn and faded, but now I saw something beneath it. Shapes. Faint, pale outlines. I leaned closer, and my breath caught. They weren't stains. They were eyes. Dozens of them pressed into the wall like wet clay, their lids sealed shut but twitching as though they were dreaming. And as I stared, one of them opened. It wasn't human. The pupil was too wide, the white of the eye too dark, but it was looking right at me. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I turned away, but in the corner of my vision, I saw more. Eyes in the ceiling, eyes in the floorboards, eyes behind every crack and seam in the wood, all watching, all waiting. I ran. The hallways twisted around me like a maze, doors leading to places they shouldn't, rooms I didn't remember passing before. I slammed one door behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath, and then I saw it. A mirror. It stood in the corner of the room, tall and cracked down the center. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but it wasn't just me. Behind me, in the reflection, the walls were alive. Faces writhed beneath the wallpaper, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes those endless watching eyes, blinking in unison. I turned around. The walls were bare, but in the mirror, they were still there. A whisper crawled across the room, so close it felt like it brushed my ear. "We see you." The lights flickered. My reflection didn't move. It just smiled, slowly, unnaturally, lips peeling back too far. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me, my footsteps pounding like gunshots against the floor. I didn't stop until I reached the grand foyer, and that's when I realized. Every portrait, every face in those frames, they weren't paintings anymore. They were watching me too. I locked myself in my room at the inn that night, but it didn't matter. The mansion never really let me leave. I could still hear it faintly, through the walls of the inn, that deep rhythmic breathing, like something enormous, sleeping just out of sight. And worse, sometimes, I swore I heard my name in the wind. I opened Elias Grayson's journal again, desperate for an answer I hadn't seen before. My hands were trembling so badly, I almost tore the pages as I turned them. And then I found it, an entry I hadn't noticed before, scrawled in the margins in jagged, frantic handwriting. "The house chooses its own. The blood finds a way." At first it didn't make sense, but then I saw it. Another note, this one tucked into the back cover of the journal. A family record, the Grayson family tree. I followed the lines and names, my pulse pounding. Elias, his sons, his grandsons, generations of tragedy and disappearances. And then at the very bottom, two names scratched out violently in ink. But one name was circled, my last name. I stared at it in disbelief, my mouth dry. No, this was impossible. I wasn't a Grayson. My family had no connection here. This had to be a mistake. And yet, memories surfaced. My grandmother's warnings about the hill, her fear of this town, the reason no one ever spoke about our ancestors. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. I looked toward the window, and in the distance I saw the mansion. For the first time, I understood why it felt like it was watching me. It wasn't just any house. It was mine. The sound came from behind me, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under unseen weight. I turned sharply, my flashlight beam cutting through the room. In the corner stood a figure, tall, thin. Its face was pale, and its hollow eyes burned with a sickly green glow. I knew that face. I had seen it in the portraits. Elias Grayson. He smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of his lips, and raised one long bony finger. He pointed to me, then in a voice that wasn't entirely sound, but something deeper, something felt, I heard him. "Welcome home." Air, the light in my room flickered. The walls seemed to shift, faintly breathing, and in the distance, up on the hill, The mansion's windows glowed brighter than ever. It wasn't just calling me anymore. It was claiming me. I didn't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, I was standing at my window. The mansion was there, framed by the morning fog. Its black windows glowed faintly, like watchful eyes fixed on me. I should have been terrified, but instead, a strange calm washed over me, like I was being invited. The journal lay open on the table, a page I didn't remember turning to staring back at me. The house calls its own. Do not resist. The walls are waiting. I slammed it shut, but the words were already in my head, crawling like insects under my skin. I grabbed my coat and fled the inn, but instead of running away, my feet carried me toward the hill. The fog was thicker than ever, curling around the trees like fingers. I didn't even feel the cold anymore. I didn't feel anything, just the pull. Each step closer to the mansion made the air heavier, but it wasn't suffocating. It was welcoming. When I reached the gates, they opened for me without a sound. Inside, the mansion felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with each breath I took. I should have been horrified, but instead, I felt something else: familiarity, like coming home after being away for too long. Then I heard it, there. The whisper slid through the halls soft and low, but it came from everywhere at once. I followed it up the grand staircase, past the portraits whose eyes now tracked me openly. Some of them smiled. At the end of the hallway, a door I'd never seen before stood wide open. Inside was a room untouched by dust or decay. The furniture was pristine, the curtains drawn back to let in pale gray light, and on the wall above the fireplace hung a single massive portrait. Me. My blood ran cold. Not exactly me, but close enough. The face was younger, the clothes older, but the resemblance was undeniable, and beneath it, written in curling script, Jonathan Grayson. The air returned. I stumbled back, my hands shaking violently. That's when the house exhaled, a long deep sound, like it was sighing in satisfaction. The floor trembled beneath me, and the door behind me slammed shut. The walls closed in, faintly warping as whispers filled the room. You belong to us. We've been waiting. The bloodline feeds the house. I clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The portrait's eyes glowed faintly, and the voice, my voice, echoed in my head. Come home. And then, I moved. Not on my own. My feet stepped forward as if the floor itself pushed me toward the portrait. The house wasn't just calling me anymore. It was claiming me. The mansion wouldn't let me leave. I don't even remember how I escaped that room with the portrait. One moment, the house was pulling me toward it, and then suddenly, I was in the hall, gasping for breath. My hands were raw from clawing at the walls, but I didn't care. I had to know the truth, before the house swallowed me completely. The journal gave me the answer. On one of its last pages, in handwriting so faint it was almost invisible, I found it below the heart. The root remains. I knew what it meant. The cellar. I descended the staircase again, every step shaking beneath me, as though the house resented my intrusion. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. When I reached the altar in the center of the cellar, the floor shifted slightly, and I saw it a seam in the stone. A hidden door. It took everything I had to pry it open. The stench that spilled out was unbearable. Rot, old blood, and something older, something that smelled like earth, left undisturbed for centuries. I held my flashlight tight, and climbed down the narrow passage. At the bottom, I found a room that felt older than the mansion itself. The walls weren't wood or stone, they were packed earth, dark and wet, with twisted roots jutting out like skeletal fingers. But these weren't normal roots. They pulsed faintly, like veins under skin, carrying something black and oily through them. And in the center of the room was a massive, gnarled structure, a tree, or at least it used to be a tree. Its bark was blackened and split, and human faces, half-formed, half swallowed, were embedded in its trunk, their mouths frozen open in silent screams, their eyes rolled and twitched, as though they were still alive, trapped in endless torment. I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. This was the root of the Grayson curse. Elias's journal had spoken of a pact, sealed in blood. But this wasn't just a pact. It was a feeding ground. Every sacrifice, every soul consumed by the house, had been dragged down here, bound into this monstrous thing. As I stared at it, one of the faces turned toward me, its lips peeled back, and in a voice that was 100 voices at once, it spoke, "You carry the blood. You will keep us alive." The roots shifted, dragging across the floor like snakes. They reached toward me, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the inevitable. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut behind me, but even as I fled, I felt it, the faint tug, deep in my chest, like a hook buried in my heart, pulling me back toward that cursed root. The house wasn't done with me, because I wasn't just its victim, I was its heir. I didn't go back to the inn that night. Instead, I wandered into the town, desperate for answers. The faces of the townsfolk had always been distant, almost fearful, but now, as I walked through the fog-covered streets, I noticed something I hadn't before. They weren't afraid of me, they were watching me. Every pair of eyes followed me. A shopkeeper locked his door the moment I passed. A woman holding a lantern whispered something to the man beside her, and they both turned their backs to me, as if I was something unholy. And then I saw him, the old man, who had warned me on my first day here. He was standing outside the tavern, staring at me like he'd been waiting. "You've been to the house," he said, his voice raw and trembling. I nodded. "I know what it is. The root. The faces in the walls. It's alive." He grabbed my arm before I could finish. His grip was stronger than I expected. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing around at the other townsfolk, who were now pretending not to hear us. "You all know, don't you?" I said. "This whole town, you're a part of it." The old man's eyes were sunken, haunted. "We don't have a choice. None of us do. If the house isn't fed, if the bloodline ends," he swallowed hard, his voice cracking, "it takes the town instead." I froze. His words sank in like ice. "You mean?" He nodded. "We give it what it wants. A traveler, a stranger, sometimes even one of our own. We keep it quiet because it has to stay quiet, or it'll come for everyone." My stomach turned. "You've been feeding it." The old man's gaze dropped to the ground. For generations, suddenly, everything made sense. The silence, the fear in their eyes, the way no one ever set foot near the mansion. They weren't just afraid of it, they were complicit. I staggered back, my breath shallow. The old man leaned closer, his voice now barely more than a whisper. "And now that it's chosen you, there's no running. You're the heir. You belong to it." Behind him, the townsfolk stood in eerie stillness, their faces grim but expressionless. No one moved to help me. No one even spoke. It was then I realized, this town wasn't a sanctuary. It was a graveyard, built in the shadow of the mansion, kept alive only because they sacrificed anyone the house demanded. And now, it wanted me. As I stumbled back toward the inn, I could feel it, an invisible thread pulling me uphill toward the mansion. The whispers followed me, crawling through the fog, almost gleeful. "Come home. The bloodline returns. Feed the root." The town didn't try to stop me, because they wanted me to go. The town didn't stop me. No one spoke as I walked past them in the fog, my footsteps echoing like funeral bells. They only watched, silent, hollow-eyed, while I climbed the hill toward the mansion. It was as if they all knew how this would end. When I reached the gates, they were already open. The mansion stood taller than ever, its windows glowing faintly with that sickly green light, like 100 unblinking eyes waiting for me. I didn't fight it this time. Inside, the air felt heavier, alive. The walls pulsed faintly, breathing in time with me. The whispers were louder now, weaving through the corridors like a hymn. Welcome home, feed the root, join us. I followed them, past the grand staircase, down the twisting hallways, until I reached the cellar door. My hand didn't tremble when I opened it this time. I descended the stone steps, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, until the altar came into view. And then I saw it, the seam in the floor, the hidden passage I had pried open before. This time I didn't hesitate. I stepped through, descending into that impossible chamber beneath the earth. The air was worse now, heavier, wet with decay. The roots bulged and twisted along the walls, throbbing with each distant pulse. And there in the center of it all stood the blackened tree. The faces in its bark were clearer now. They moved, their mouths stretched wide, their eyes darted toward me. Some wept, others smiled, and one of them, God help me, looked exactly like me. I staggered back, but the roots shifted, slithering across the ground, curling toward my feet, like they were tasting the air. Blood for brick, flesh for mortar. The voices rose in unison, a deafening chant that vibrated through my bones. I clutched the journal, the last piece of Elias Grayson, searching for any line, any word that could stop this. But there was nothing, only one final note, scribbled at the bottom of the page, barely legible. When the air returns, the house will feed. There is no escape. The roots lunged, one coiled around my ankle, cold and slick, like dead flesh. I tore free and stumbled backward, but more were coming. And then I saw it, a small iron dagger resting on the altar, its blade blackened with age. The journal's earlier words flashed in my mind. Blood binds the house, blood opens the door. If blood had sealed this curse, maybe blood could end it. The roots reached for me again, faster now, hungry. I grabbed the dagger, my hand trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. Come home, Elias's voice, close, too close. I raised the dagger, staring at the monstrous tree, at the faces that writhed and whispered in the dark. My heart pounded. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and then I stepped forward, toward the root, toward the end. The dagger was heavier than it should have been, its iron blade cold enough to burn my skin. I stood before the blackened tree, its roots shifting and coiling like serpents in the dark. The faces trapped in its bark writhed, their eyes wide, their mouths opening and closing in silent pleas. The voices in my head grew louder. You cannot leave. Feed the root. Become one of us. I clutched the dagger tighter, my breath ragged. My bloodline had built this nightmare. Generations of Graysons had kept this thing alive, feeding it, binding it, and now it wanted me. Unless I gave it something else. I pressed the blade to my palm. The edge bit into my skin with a sharp, burning sting, and blood welled up instantly, sliding down the handle. The whispers shifted, growing frantic, hungry. The roots inched closer. Yes, feed us. But instead of stepping closer to the tree, I raised the dagger higher. No, I whispered, my voice trembling but steady. I'm not feeding you. I'm ending this. I drove the blade into the trunk. The scream that followed was inhuman, deafening, a sound so deep it shook the earth. The faces in the bark contorted in agony, their mouths tearing open wider than any human mouth should. The roots lashed out violently, wrapping around my arms and legs, trying to pull me closer, but I didn't stop. I drove the dagger in deeper, twisting it until my blood mingled with the blackened sap that poured from the wound. The chamber trembled, the roots convulsed, slamming into the walls. The faces wailed, the entire mansion above groaned like a living creature in pain. And then, the tree began to split. A jagged crack tore down its center, black sap spilling out in torrents. The faces screamed louder, and one by one they began to vanish, dissolving into dust. The roots loosened their grip on me. For a moment I thought I had won, until I heard it, a low guttural whisper. If you kill the root, you take its place. The tree shuddered violently. The ground split beneath my feet. The roots surged toward me, wrapping around my chest, my arms, my throat, not pulling me in to devour me, but binding me to it. I understood then, to kill the root, I had to replace it. The faces on the trunk turned to me, their empty eyes full of something like pity. I felt myself sinking, my blood burning, my body fusing with the wood, the roots, the curse itself. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the tree collapsing in on itself, the roots retreating into the earth, the mansion falling silent, and then there was nothing. When I opened my eyes, everything was still. The roots that had bound me were gone. The blackened tree, split in two, was nothing more than ash scattered across the cold earth. I stood in the hidden chamber, my hand still clutching the dagger, only now it was clean, as though it had never been used, and above me, silence. For the first time since I had stepped foot in that cursed mansion, I couldn't hear the breathing. No whispers, no shifting walls, just nothing. I climbed out of the passage and into the cellar. The air was still heavy with the stench of blood and rot, but even that was fading. The chains no longer swayed, the faces in the walls had vanished, leaving behind only cold, lifeless stone. When I emerged into the mansion's grand hall, I almost didn't recognize it. The walls no longer pulsed, the portraits no longer stared, the windows were dark and empty. The house was dead. I should have felt relief, but instead, an unsettling calm settled over me. I walked to the front doors and pushed them open. The fog outside had begun to lift, revealing the town below. For the first time it didn't feel suffocating. But then I saw them. The townsfolk stood at the edge of the road, staring up at the mansion. No one spoke, no one moved. Their faces were pale, blank, almost expectant. They knew. I stepped out onto the porch, my body heavy, my fingers trembling around the journal. The house didn't call to me anymore, but something else did. Deep beneath my skin, I felt it, a faint pulse, slow, rhythmic. The root was gone, but the bloodline remained, and I was still the heir. One by one, the townsfolk bowed their heads, not to the mansion, to me. I turned back toward the house. Its windows were empty, lifeless, but in that emptiness, I saw my reflection, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw Elias Grayson standing behind me, smiling faintly, his hollow eyes burning green. The wind shifted, and in it I heard the faintest whisper, "The house is never truly silent." I didn't go back inside, not that night, not ever, but I knew the truth. The mansion wasn't dead, it was only sleeping, and it was waiting for me to wake it.